A homeless man approached the millionaire in a coma, and something unexpected happened. The scream came from far away, but it kept getting closer, first as a muffled noise at the far end of the hall, then nearer, sharper, more desperate, and when the automatic doors on the third floor opened with that blast of cold hospital air, everyone there stopped what they were doing. An old man, with disheveled white hair and a long, shapeless beard, wearing a dark coat so torn it barely stayed on his shoulders, came down the hallway shouting. The two security guards in black uniforms following him could barely keep up. "Let me in! Only I can wake this man up! Only me!" The youngest nurse dropped her clipboard. An elderly man waiting on a plastic chair stood up startled, and Dr. Benjamin Hayes, a 28-year-old resident who was jotting down notes in the hallway, stood frozen for a full second before reacting. "Stop! Stop right there." The old man didn't stop. He pushed open the door to room 314 with both hands and moved to the edge of the bed before the security guards grabbed him by both arms. Even then, he didn't stop looking. He kept his eyes fixed on that man lying there, motionless, connected to tubes and monitors beeping in a steady rhythm. He looked at him like someone recognizing something they hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm his father," the old man said, his voice suddenly sinking, tears streaming through the dirt on his face. "I am that man's father." Dr. Hayes stepped forward. "Sir, the father of Mr. David Sterling passed away. The whole family knows that." The old man slowly shook his head, like someone who already expected not to be believed. "I know what everyone thinks. I know what he himself used to say, but I'm here. I'm alive. And that boy lying there has a crescent-shaped scar on his left shoulder, one he got when he was 7 years old, trying to climb onto the roof of the mill. No one knows about that. But I do." The silence that fell over that hallway was the kind you feel in your bones. Dr. Hayes didn't say another word. He told the security guards to take the old man out of the hospital, but he stood in the hallway for a long time after the doors closed, head down, thinking, because he had performed the admission physical on Mr. David Sterling. He knew that scar, crescent-shaped on the left shoulder, exactly where the old man had said. I had to pause for a second when I got to that part of the story, because there's something very specific about the pain of a man who knows he won't be believed before he even opens his mouth, who shows up already prepared for disbelief, who says what he has to say anyway. David Sterling was 53 years old and had built one of the biggest construction companies in the tri-state area from scratch. Well, that's what everyone said. The official story was this: son of a man who had passed too soon, raised by his mother through great struggle, graduated in engineering on an academic scholarship, partner of businessman Michael Vance at 30, owner of half the company at 40. A nice, tidy story, the kind that appears in magazine interviews. But David had been in a coma for 22 days. He had collapsed in his own office on a Tuesday afternoon with no warning. The doctors talked about a collapse from severe exhaustion, aggravated by uncontrolled high blood pressure. What no one knew, at least not yet, was what had happened in the hours before the collapse. What conversation, what discovery, what weight had fallen on him that afternoon. His wife, Catherine Sterling, 46 years old, showed up every morning with her hair done and red eyes. She would sit in the leather chair next to the bed, take her husband's hand, and stay silent. Sometimes she spoke softly. Sometimes she just stared. Over the past few days, she had always arrived accompanied by Michael Vance, the business partner, a broad-shouldered man in an always neatly pressed suit, with a smile too steady for someone visiting a partner in a coma. Michael had started talking to the company's lawyers about an emergency power of attorney, about the need for someone to make decisions while David couldn't, about how waiting any longer could jeopardize important contracts, employees, suppliers. "Catherine, you need to think about what's best for you right now," he said one afternoon, in that gentle voice people use when they want to sound reasonable. "David wouldn't want you to suffer like this, waiting for something the doctors can't guarantee." She didn't answer that day, but she looked at him for a moment longer than she should have. Dr. Hayes, that same night, stayed late at Mercy General Hospital, not because of a shift, because of unease. He flipped through Mr. David Sterling's chart, then sat in the cafeteria drinking cold coffee, thinking about that old man with deep-set eyes, who had said something he could only know if it were true. The next day, before dawn, he left the hospital and walked to the Miller Street overpass, about a 15-minute walk from there. It was common knowledge among the staff that a group of homeless people sheltered in that stretch. Lucas had never been there. He arrived slowly, carrying a coffee he'd bought at Sunny Day Bakery on the way, still warm in his hand. Arthur Sterling was sitting leaning against a piece of cardboard, hands in his lap, staring at the empty street. 71 years old, though he looked older from the weight etched on his face. His hair completely white and disheveled, his beard long and unkempt, his dark coat full of mismatched patches. But his eyes, when they turned to the doctor, had a surprising clarity. "I knew you'd come," Arthur said without surprise. "Doctor." Hayes crouched down to his level and held out the coffee. The old man accepted it with both hands. "Tell me," Dr. Hayes said simply. And Arthur told him. The mill had been in the family a long time ago, Heritage Mills, a textile factory his father had built, and that Arthur had inherited while still young. For years it ran well, employed many people from the neighborhood, supported the family with dignity. Arthur married, had a son, David, and for a time thought life was in the right place. Then came the blow. A man named Silas Vance, a partner in a larger company in the tri-state area, approached Arthur with an expansion proposal. Papers were signed, money was moved. And within 2 years, through maneuvers Arthur only understood when it was too late, the mill came under Silas's control, and Arthur was left with debts he couldn't pay and a shame he didn't know how to carry. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot since we're just starting out. Now, continuing. He sank. He drank for a while. He disappeared from home for days on end. And one dawn, when he looked at his 7-year-old son sleeping and thought he was too heavy a burden for those small shoulders, Arthur Sterling made the worst choice of his life. He left a note saying he wasn't coming back and walked away. "I thought he'd be better off without a father who'd lost everything," said the old man, his voice like something that creaks but doesn't break. "I thought the shame was mine and didn't have to be his too." Dr. Hayes said nothing. He let the silence fill the space it needed. Years later, I found out he started saying I had died, that his father had gone forever. I understood. It was easier to be the son of a dead man than the son of a man who had chosen to leave. Arthur said he never stopped watching over his son from afar. He kept newspaper clippings when David Sterling's name started appearing in business articles. He stood on the sidewalk in front of grand openings, watching his son in a suit shake hands, never approaching. 30 years like that. Until 3 weeks ago, rummaging through a pile of old newspapers someone had left on a park bench, Arthur found the news. A small note in a business column. Businessman David Sterling had been admitted in serious condition. And below it, the name of the hospital. "I walked for 3 days, Arthur said. I stopped at some churches to rest, ate what people gave me along the way. I got here yesterday." Benjamin Hayes sat with him for another hour. When he left, he hadn't made any decision yet, but there was something he couldn't stop thinking about, that this man had carried this burden for 30 years, and that he had made it there anyway. That same afternoon, Michael Vance showed up at Mercy General Hospital with a folder full of documents and asked for an urgent meeting with Catherine. She received him in a small private room, still with the tired look of someone who sleeps little. "I brought the expert witness, Catherine, the specialist I mentioned. He'll explain it better than I can." The man who entered was introduced as a private medical consultant, but Catherine had never heard his name before. He spoke with great confidence about prognoses, about recovery windows, about how transferring the patient to a specialized clinic in another state could offer more resources. "How long do you want to keep waiting here?" Michael asked when the man left. "David would sign for the employees, for the families that depend on the company. You know that." Catherine looked at him. Then she looked at the floor. "Give me a few more days, Michael." She went back to her husband's room. She sat in the chair for a long time. And then, without really knowing why, she opened the drawer of the bedside table that the family had brought from home with some of David's belongings. She usually didn't touch that drawer, but that day she opened it, At the bottom, folded many times, there was a photograph. She carefully unfolded it. It was old, the color already faded, the edges crumpled from being opened and closed so many times. In the photo, a young man, smiling, carried a small boy on his shoulder. The boy laughed with his mouth open, holding onto his father's hair so he wouldn't fall. Catherine stared at it for a long time. Then she looked again. And then she felt something tighten in her chest. The face of the young man in that photo was the same face, decades older and covered in white beard, of the homeless man the security guards had chased away 2 days before. She asked Dr. Hayes to bring the old man. Benjamin Hayes went to the Miller Street overpass at the end of the afternoon and found Arthur in the same spot, with a piece of bread in his hand that he was sharing with a pigeon. When Benjamin Hayes said that David's wife wanted to talk to him, the old man was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, folded the leftover piece of bread, and put it in his pocket. When? Now, if you want. Catherine received Arthur in the small private room. She stood up when he entered, as if she didn't quite know what to do with her body. The old man walked in with the old hat he had found on the way, holding it with both hands in front of his chest. Catherine placed the photograph on the table between them. Arthur looked at the photo. He closed his eyes for a second. "Can you tell me something that only his real father would know?" she asked, her voice controlled but her eyes moist. Arthur thought for a moment. Then he began to speak. "When David was 8 years old, he decided to fly a kite on the roof of Heritage Mills. I had told him about 3 times that it was forbidden to go up there. But boys will be boys. He sneaked up there one Sunday afternoon. He slipped, fell, broke his left arm. I carried him to the emergency room in my arms. On the way he cried more from shame than from pain, because he knew I was going to scold him. But I didn't scold him. I stayed by his side all night, holding his hand while they put the cast on." Catherine stood with her hands clasped in front of her body. Her voice came out small. "He told me that story, the night he proposed to me. He said it was the earliest memory he had of his father, a man who didn't fight when he could have fought. The silence between them was filled with things that didn't need words. 'He is my son,' Arthur said simply. 'And I left when he needed me most. I know I don't deserve anything, but if there's something I can do now before it's too late, I want to do it. There are things you hear and feel like you recognize that pain from somewhere, even if you haven't lived through it exactly. The pain of someone who arrived late, but still arrived.' Catherine cancelled the meeting about the transfer. She gave the old man official permission to visit her husband. When Michael found out the next day, he turned red with anger in the hallway. "Catherine, you don't know who this man is. He could be a con artist. He could be after the inheritance." "He described a scar that only the medical team knew about," she said, looking at him in a way she never had before. "And he told me a story that David told me only once in my life." Michael walked away with his briefcase under his arm, and his jaw clenched. Arthur started coming every day. He arrived early, stayed for hours. He sat in the chair next to the bed, held his son's hand, and talked. He talked a lot. He recounted the 30 years in detail, like someone giving an account of an absence that can't be undone, but can at least be named. He talked about the cities he'd passed through, the jobs he'd had and lost, the cold nights and the mornings without coffee, but also about the afternoons he stood on the sidewalk in front of some event of his son's, watching from afar, and about the pride mixed with shame that squeezed his chest in those moments. The head nurse on the floor, Mrs. Gable, a 62-year-old woman with grey hair pulled back in a bun, and a blunt way of speaking that intimidated the new residents, was the one who most closely followed these visits. She had been against it at first. She had rules, schedules, protocols. But one afternoon she stood outside the room listening unintentionally to the old man's hoarse voice telling his sleeping son about the day David won his first prize at school, and he stayed outside the gymnasium listening to the applause through the wall. Mrs. Gable turned to the other side of the hallway and pretended to be checking a note. But Benjamin, who was passing by at that moment, saw the corner of her eye shining. She didn't say anything to anyone. She just made sure Arthur's visits continued without obstacles. The doctors began to record discrete changes in David's tests, Small, but consistent. A variation in sleep patterns. A slight response to external stimulus that hadn't been there before. Nothing to justify a different prognosis, but enough that no one mentioned the transfer with such conviction anymore. Michael realized time was slipping through his fingers. He called an emergency meeting of the company's minority shareholders, using a clause David had signed years ago in a contract that allowed voting in situations of the main partner's prolonged incapacity. The agenda was simple. Authorize the sale of 60% of the company's shares to an investor group of which, coincidentally, Michael was a part through a third-party company. When Catherine received the notice, she sat at the kitchen table at home for an hour staring at the paper. Then she went to her husband's office, where there were some boxes with documents David had brought home in the weeks before the collapse. She had never touched those boxes. But now she opened one. And then another. And she started reading. Slowly at first, then faster, with a tightness growing in her chest. David Sterling had been investigating something. There were months of records, comparisons of financial transfers, statements marked with red pen, and in the last folder there was a document with handwritten notes that she recognized as her husband's handwriting, tight and slanted as always when he was focused. At the top of the page, underlined twice, the name Michael Vance, and below it amounts, dates, descriptions of transactions that had been systematically siphoning money from the company for at least 4 years. David Sterling had uncovered it, and he had collapsed that Tuesday afternoon carrying that weight. Catherine took the folders and went straight to Mercy General Hospital. She found Arthur Sterling sitting by his son's bed, speaking in a low voice, telling a story about a fish he had caught in a river when David was little. She waited for him to finish. Then she placed the folders on the table. "I need you to see this." Arthur flipped through the documents with an attention that surprised Catherine. He turned pages, compared dates, paused at one section for a long moment. "I know this pattern," he said finally, his voice different, heavier. "I've seen this before." And then he told her. The scheme that had destroyed the family's heritage mills decades ago. Silas Vance's company. The same marks, the same moves, the same structure of embezzlement disguised as legitimate transactions. "Silas Vance," Arthur repeated, and looked at Catherine. "Michael is Silas's son." The silence that fell over room 314 at that moment was different from the first one. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence when you suddenly understand everything that took a long time to make sense. The same greed, 2 generations, 2 families destroyed. Arthur stared at his son for a long time. "I lost everything to this man's family when you were 7 years old," he said, his voice low, as if speaking to the sleeping David. "And I walked away instead of fighting. This time will be different." On the day of the meeting, Catherine arrived with Arthur. He had showered, trimmed his beard with a borrowed pair of scissors, and wore a clean plaid shirt that one of the hospital staff had picked up for him at a store in the neighborhood. It was still obvious who he was and where he came from. But he was standing, and he was present. When Michael saw them walk through the meeting room door, the color drained from his face. Catherine asked for the floor before any vote began. She presented the documents she had found. Arthur stood beside her as she spoke, saying nothing, just present, like a witness that life had placed there for a reason neither of them had planned. The shareholders listened in silence. Some asked questions. Others requested that the documents be sent for review by the company's own lawyers, not Michael's. The vote was postponed. Michael left the meeting before it ended, and he didn't go home. He went to the hospital. Benjamin was in the hallway when Michael entered room 314 with long strides and closed the door behind him. Benjamin stood outside for a second, uncertain. Then he went in. Michael was standing by the bed, looking at David with an expression that mixed anger and something that might have been fear. Arthur had arrived right behind him with Catherine. "You're going to lose everything anyway," Michael said, his voice low but tense as a wire. "When he wakes up, if he wakes up, he's going to have to deal with the same thing his father had to deal with. Some things don't change." "My father handled it the wrong way," Arthur said, with a calm that cut through the air. "He left, and he carried that for 30 years. But my son did things differently. He stayed, and he found out what you were doing, and he left proof. You're nobody, Michael said louder now. You're an old man off the street who showed up out of nowhere. No one's going to believe you. I know I'm nobody, Arthur replied without anger, without trembling. I'm a man who made a mistake and took too long to try to fix it, but the documents Catherine presented today aren't mine. They're David's, and they'll speak for themselves. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing, it was at that moment. It wasn't a loud noise, it wasn't a sudden movement. It was almost nothing. David's hand, resting on the blue sheet, slowly closed around his father's fingers. Everyone saw it at the same time. Benjamin took 2 quick steps to the monitor panel. The readings were changing. Catherine covered her mouth with her hands, and old Arthur stood still, his eyes fixed on his son's hand around his, unable to move. David Sterling's eyes opened slowly. They blinked, tried to focus. His lips moved once, twice, before any sound came out. The first word came out hoarse, almost breathless, but it came. Dad. Michael stepped back to the wall. He stood there for a moment that seemed very long. Then he left the room without saying another word. The cry that came from Arthur was the kind you can't hold back. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't gentle. It was 30 years of crying all at once, bent over the bed holding his son's hand, shoulders shaking and voice sobbing words no one could understand anymore. Benjamin stood outside with Catherine. She was leaning against the hallway wall, her knees slightly bent, and Benjamin stood beside her without saying a word. Sometimes there's nothing to say. Mrs. Gable walked down the hallway, looked at the two of them, looked through the small window in the room door, and kept walking. But this time she didn't pretend she was checking any notes. The recovery wasn't quick. It never is. David spent weeks at Mercy General Hospital, then more weeks in rehabilitation. His body had been still for too long, and the process of getting back was slow, sometimes frustrating, full of days when he woke up in pain and could barely lift his arm. Arthur was there every day. He pushed the wheelchair through the gardens when David started sitting up. He stayed by his side during physical therapy sessions. He brought homemade food that he learned to cook in the kitchen of the house where Catherine had insisted he stay. And during that time between the gardens and the hallways and shared meals, David talked. A lot. Something he didn't usually do. He spoke of his grievances. He spoke of how much it hurt to grow up believing his father had left, and how that lie had become an armor he carried for decades, too heavy but necessary. He spoke of how he had built every company, every contract, every achievement, as if he were proving something to a man who wasn't there to see it. I was starving for affection, he said one afternoon, with the direct tone of someone who learned that holding words inside hurts more than letting them out. In the midst of everything I had, I was starving for affection. And I didn't even know how to name it. Arthur listened to everything without defending himself, without trying to explain too much, just present, as he had promised to be, day after day. There were difficult moments between the two, fights that surfaced in conversations that started calmly and ended with raised voices and closed doors. There was an afternoon when David said he had hated his father for years, and Arthur said he knew and that he had the right, and that he had come back anyway because it was late, but not impossible. Not every forgiveness comes all at once. Some forgiveness comes gradually, like a plant that grows without us noticing, and one day you look and it's there. Michael Vance was removed from the company through an internal process conducted by the shareholders themselves and by the lawyers David hired as soon as he was able. There was no public scandal, no confrontation. Only documents, meetings, votes, truths presented with solid evidence that David had built before it all came crashing down. The company continued, the employees stayed, and Michael Vance's name was removed from the wall in the conference room without ceremony. When David was sufficiently recovered, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including Catherine. He found the address of where his grandfather's heritage mills had been, abandoned for decades, with walls overgrown with weeds and the roof partially open. He bought the land and what remained of the building, and he began to restore it. He didn't hire a large contractor. He hired the former employees who were still in the city, some already retired but willing to come back for a season. He went every day, at first still leaning on a cane, and worked alongside them. Arthur went with him, with hands that no longer had the strength they once did, but that still knew how to hold a tool. He spent hours working in silence beside his son, and sometimes one of them would make a joke that the other understood without needing context, that private language that exists only between people who have lived through the same things. The day of the reopening was on a Saturday morning. The sun was good. The former employees came with their families, neighbors who had spent years seeing that building closed, a few local journalists who had grown curious about the restoration story. Catherine stayed by her husband's side the whole time. At one point she took his hand and squeezed it. He squeezed back. Arthur kept a little apart from the center of the party, leaning against one of the old machines that had been restored and polished until it shone. Benjamin was there too, personally invited by David, not quite understanding why he had been included. He only found out when David approached, and said that without him he would never have had the chance to hear the story he needed to hear. At the end of the morning, when most of the guests had spread out across the hall and coffee and cake were being served on long tables, David went to his father. Arthur reached into his coat pocket, no longer the torn coat from before, but a new one, of navy blue wool that Catherine had chosen. He pulled out an old metal key, oxidized by time, with a worn piece of string as a keychain. "This is the original key to the mill," he said, his voice low. "I carried it in my pocket for 30 years. I don't really know why. I guess it was the only thing I still had that was ours." David took the key with both hands. He looked at it for a moment. "Now it's going to hang on the wall," he said, and he smiled. Later, when almost everyone had gone, and the afternoon light streamed wide through the new windows of the mill, David climbed onto a chair and hung two things on the wall, side by side, the old key on the worn string and the crumpled photograph of the boy on his father's shoulder, framed in simple glass. He looked at the two things for a moment, and then he understood, with all the clarity that sometimes takes a lifetime to arrive, that the greatest inheritance he had received was not the company he had built, not the contracts and the properties and the numbers he had accumulated, trying to prove something to an absent man. The greatest inheritance was the white-haired man sitting in a chair beneath that photo, drinking coffee, with the key to the mill back where it should never have left. End of story. Look, I need to confess something. When I finished reading this story for the first time, I sat quietly for a while before I could say anything. There are stories that pass by and stories that stay. This one stayed. David spent his whole life accumulating to prove something to someone who wasn't there to see it, and Arthur spent 30 years on the outside, looking at his son from afar, with a mix of pride and shame, without the courage to knock on the door. Two men starting from the same point, each carrying half of something that would only be whole when the two of them were in the same place. If you made it this far, thank you truly for sticking around. Tell us how this story made you feel, and also where you're watching from. What do you think you would have done if you were in David Sterling's shoes when Arthur reappeared after 30 years? Leave it in the comments, because I read every single one. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.